What's up? Welcome to the Babbling Pastor Podcast, guys. If you are seeing this episode, you haven't canceled this. Welcome. My name is Michael, and this is
Rob.
Yes. If you're still here from the last episode, welcome. A double extra welcome. We're glad you're here. Rob, I'm glad that you're still not canceled. I'm glad I'm still not canceled.
People are used to me saying things like that, so.
Oh, okay, good.
I'm not too worried about it.
All right. Well, welcome to the Babbling Pastor Podcast, the podcast in which we babble and talk about a variety of different things, reacting to all of the posts on X. You see how I didn't say tweets on Twitter? You see how I didn't?
Nice.
I'm getting the language.
Well played.
Getting the language correct. So
Super
today,
cultured.
guys. Yes. Well, I am. I'm a very cultured individual. The kind of guy that doesn't wear Crocs. I'm the kind of guy that wears a dress shirt with a hat. That's just a little. I'm just a little different. I'm a different kind of breed. So anyway, this is where we're at. Oh man.
All right.
Okay. So today we're gonna be reacting to he's not a really controversial figure. Nobody really talks about him a lot. You may not have heard about him. Joel Webbon. Have you heard of this guy? I don't know. It's on Twitter. X.
Yes.
Okay,
I think.
Okay.
Possibly.
He seems to either intentionally or unintentionally stir up the interwebs on occasion. I did a sermon review of him a while back. It was interesting. It wasn't terrible, but he did spend a lot of time talking about theater kids and how weak they are and how they should be shoved in lockers. It was an interesting little bunny trail off of the actual sermon. I think he talked about Narnia a little bit there too. There was some examples that went on a little longer than they should have, but the sermon itself wasn't terrible. It was an interesting comment about theater kids, though. I wasn't sure how to take that. I don't
even know what that means. What's a theater kid?
It's a kid that does a lot of performative arts in school. Typically,
okay.
Typically, the more
when
emotional.
I think about theater, I'm thinking go watch the movie or something. But no, I get it now.
No.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's the kind of kids that would be singing the theme songs to Wicked. Those kids.
Sure. Okay. All right. Yeah.
so those kids.
Yeah.
So he recently, I saved this on.
Let it go. Let it go.
That's not Wicked, but okay.
No, I know, but that's
okay, got it.
That would be an example of a theater kid.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. So he recently, I guess he has a podcast. I don't listen to it, but he does have a podcast. And here, somebody posted the other day a clip from it. This is 7 minutes. Okay, just so everybody knows, we're not watching the entire 7 minutes of this, but there was an interesting point at the beginning of this. Also, I just want to say from the get-go, as somebody that likes to watch the full context of everything, I don't know the context of this. Just commenting on this little section of a 7-minute clip, not even the whole clip. I do think it brings up an interesting point that I am very interested to pick your brain about. So let's listen to a part of this, and then we'll get into it.
And let's just say it. I feel like it goes without saying, but obviously it doesn't. So let's say it. What do we not like about Andrew Tate? What do we denounce?
Where to start?
He's Muslim.
Yep.
He worships a demon god named Allah. He's a foreigner. He doesn't live in England. He's traveling the world saying that he's for nationalism, but going into countries that are not his own.
He's perverse and profane as the day is long, without any filter whatsoever.
Crude, perverse, lewd. He sexualizes women, which is not Christian masculinity.
Right.
It is masculine.
Right.
It is masculine, but it's masculinity debased by sin. It is contorted and corrupted masculinity. But it is, when I say it's still masculine, maybe you've heard this expression, maybe you haven't. Some people don't like it. Which
means it's a good one.
Which means it's good, yeah. Have you ever heard somebody say, he's sinning but he's sinning in the right direction. Have you ever heard that adage? It's like, well, no sin can be in the right direction. To sin is to miss the mark. It's to point, the bow in the wrong direction. It's to go the opposite of the direction of God. And so all sin is in the wrong. Yes. No, duh. Of course, all sin is going away from God. It's rebelling against God. And so therefore, in the macro sense, of course, in a theological ultimate sense, all sin is in the wrong direction. Here's what the expression means: to sin in the right direction. A guy who is a womanizer is sinning. Okay, again, I said we're going to state our bona fides. So let me say that again so it's blatantly clear. Sinning. It's sin. Andrew Tate has made a career for himself that has been marked in many ways by overt, plain, obvious sin. Of course.
Yep.
Of course. Duh. However, the Trans Library Story Hour is not only sin, but it's sinning in the wrong direction. It's when I'm speaking of direction, I'm speaking of nature. There's
conformity to reality.
Okay, I think that's pretty far enough into the clip. I think we get the idea of what the general gist of what is going on. Also, I just want to say, I can't zoom in, unfortunately, to this video. There's Right Response Ministry candles, Rob. We need to have Babbling Pastor podcast candles. And I'm going to need you to get on that. You got us these mugs. I'm going to need... If you look, you can't see him probably in the video, but they're right there beside on. He's flanked by two right response ministry candles. And you know what they smell like?
I'll see what I can do.
Do you know what they smell like? They smell like godliness. That's the scent.
I think it's a scent of sinning in the right direction.
Okay, so there's mine. So I brought this clip, so I'm going to have you react to it first. Because I think, here's the thing. I think what I did see, I'll say this before I show it over you. I saw a lot of responses to this that seemed more reactionary than anything else, which I find interesting. So what are your thoughts here?
So I think that, so I have seen as much of the clip that we saw. I don't even think I've seen the whole 7 minutes of the clip, but I've seen.
So it's a lot of time to dedicate online to it.
Yeah. So I'll say a couple of things to give some context to my thoughts. On the one hand, there's part of I used to watch Joel Webbon. I used to watch Right Response Ministries, the podcast. And I used to watch it kind of regularly because he would talk about some things that I think were good and helpful that a lot of people weren't talking about. And then I think one of the reasons that I stopped, at least stopped regularly listening to it, is because I kind of found myself, whenever he would have people on the podcast to interview them, he was talking about 2/3 more than they were. Like, the point is to interview them, and that he had to interrupt. And it's like, it left me often going, bro, shut up and let them answer. Right. And so it was really more of like an annoyance thing when I kind of just stopped. But I will say that, he has some of the comments based on this clip, I think have like, people are already coming to it with a bad taste in their mouth when it comes to Joel Webbon. And to some, for what it's worth, with a correct bad taste in their mouth with some of the things that he's been up to recently. Particularly, there's like some unwarranted anti-Semitism kind of stuff that they've been talking about. There are some, I think in an unintentionally, and this little clip is a taste of it. But they are making masculinity more than what the scriptures make of it, I think. I certainly, and we this is what we were just laughingly joking about our podcast being canceled and whatever was because we were talking about men being men and women being women. Like, there is a reality that has been a lost thing in our national context and in our evangelical context. That has been something that is lost, that hasn't been correctly. And so, long story short, it lends itself to make room for all sorts of opinions about it. And what is actually biblical? What is biblical masculinity? What is biblical femininity? How do we get back there? How do we teach on it? How do we whatever, right? I do find it ironic that he thought of Andrew Tate's being a foreigner or something before he thought, and someone else had to say perverse, and some of the more obvious, like, yeah, this guy's not a Christian. I think that we should be promoting godly masculinity, and I do think there's room to talk about an example of a guy who's not even a Christian who has got masculinity more correct than a lot of guys who claim to be Christians. I'm not saying that's Andrew Tate, okay? But I will say that there are men in the world who do not belong to Christ, who are not in Christ, who couldn't care less about God, who are more, at least when it comes to their characteristics and traits and how they do life, who would be more correctly or biblically masculine than a lot of men in the church, like the examples that I used last time: men who aren't leading their homes, men who are allowing, like, their wives seem to be fine with it, so I'm cool to just be passive. I'll not go to church. I'll not teach the children. All of those things. And so there are men who take manhood more seriously outside of the church than some who do inside of the church. And that's a real problem. And if that's what we're talking about, I mean, yeah, I agree. I think that using Andrew Tate to demonstrate that is laughable and not like not the person I would use. However, I do understand what he's getting at with the sinning in the right direction thing. He's saying that essentially that Andrew Tate in his womanizing is at least it's sexual sin with a woman. Like, or with women. That's what he's getting at, and I understand what he's trying to say. I think that, like, I could have done without the information presented in that podcast. It's not actually helpful, but that's where I'm at.
So I think it seems as if we're basically on the same page here, which is that, and I'm here. I'll say this: I'm sure that people probably have the same preconceptions of either you or I or other people that, like, put stuff online. Like, you come to a channel with preconceived notions about people. So people obviously, like you said, already have a preconceived notion of Joel Webbon from what they've seen. So when they come to hear this, they already are like, this dude's stupid. I ain't going to listen to a thing he says. This is just like one more dumb thing. Which, to be fair, if you say enough dumb things, like I did a review of a talk that Russell Brand gave at a church, and he said that there was a bunch of people in England that were accusing him of all sorts of things. And he goes, to be fair, I gave them a lot of material to work with. And so I think if you put out enough stuff that really sort of doesn't make you the most listenable to person out there, or you sort of put forth sort of a, like you had mentioned on the last episode, the criteria I have for sermon reviews. The reason I have those is because when I first started doing them, it kept coming up that I was nitpicking or coming off too critical. So I was like, well, how do I not do that? Because that's not my intent. So how do I not do that? So I put, structure into place to prevent that as much as possible, mitigate it. And so I think that if somebody like, Joel comes off in a certain way, he can say, well, like they said, well, nobody likes it, which means it's right. You can take that stance, I suppose, if you'd like, or you can say, okay, well, maybe there's some merit here and I should, explain myself better, or, approach things in a different way. So I think when people come to this clip automatically, they're like, oh, it's Joel. Got it. It's going to be bad. It's going to be stupid.
Yeah.
And again, I think you're right on the example we're pulling out here. There's better, like less controversial ones. Like everyone also has an opinion on Tate. So if you have Joel Webbon, which is already somebody that has all of this stuff around him, mentioning somebody that has all of this stuff around him, whenever you talk about the different levels of severity of sexual sin, by the time you get to that, no one is listening to you anymore. So
yeah,
it comes to the point to where it does the message is important, but it's also how you deliver that message. And so like, yeah, you can go to the scripture and see, I mean, just for example, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 9 and 10 are great examples where Paul says, do not be deceived, neither the sexually immoral or idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who have sex with other men, or thieves, or greedy, or drunkards, or slanderers, or swindlers will inherit the kingdom of heaven. And so if we're just talking about sexual sin, Paul names 3. These are not all the same thing. We see this even in the early church where adultery is held as like, you're out of the church, bro. Like you're out. And so there's obviously this understanding, not only in the New Testament, but within the early church, that there are levels here of it's not that it's not sin. It is all sin, but there are different, because of this, the implications that come with this, then there's different levels of severity here. And so when Joel talks about sinning in the right direction, first of all, I think it's just a poor word usage. It's just like there's better ways. There's better ways to present this idea and get your point across. There's a better way to say that Andrew Tate, in his debauchery, is still sinning, but it's not it's still a disoriented passion, but it's not a distorted, disoriented passion as you would see within LGBTQ+. And so there's a way to distinguish that and say, like, this is all sin, but there are varying levels and consequences to this sin, without giving the whole buildup of like, what do we hate about Andrew Tate? Well, at least he's sinning in the right direction. It's like, yeah, okay. Like, I think your point is lost by the time you get to your point.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I think that like I said, I think that you could argue that there are men who are not necessarily godly men, and maybe not Christian men, who did. So I would probably pick General Mattis, or there's several men throughout history, and even men who are alive now. Let's pick. Let's say, okay, you ready to get canceled again?
Again? Sure.
Yeah. Re-canceled. Actually, this is right after the last one, so we're probably just still canceled. So
we haven't come back.
So let's say, what about Donald Trump? Right? So there's an example of a man. Now, do I think I think that he is more pragmatic than moral. Okay. I think that he is more like practical. Let's do a deal. I need to win. Those kinds. I think that he's more that than he is moral. However, the things that he does, the characteristics about him, there are a lot of characteristics you could point to in Donald Trump that are more correctly masculine than many characteristics of Christian leaders, even, right? Not all Christian leaders, certain Christian leaders, but his willingness to stand in the face of adversity, to not give a crap what people have to say about that's contrary to what is right and good and true. Never mind that what he thinks is right and good and true isn't necessarily from the scriptures, but based on the worldview that was created here in America from the scriptures. But obviously there are lots of things about Donald Trump that we could point to that are not good, not biblical, that are corrupt, that are even disgusting, you might say, or whatever, right? Like there are things like that about him, sure. But you could point to him and say, this characteristic, this characteristic, this characteristic, these are things that men in the church ought to have more of. And in these few things, he's actually acting more like a biblical man than many men in the church. You could have that conversation. And I think a person might even be able to have that conversation with Andrew Tate as like there are probably characteristics about him that you could point to that more biblical men ought to have and harness, right? But I completely agree that sinning in the right direction is just not helpful. I understand what he's trying to get at, but it's not helpful. Because just on its face, you cannot sin in the right direction. Like that's not a thing. And so I understand what he's trying to get at. I think it's a poor way to get there. There probably are better ways to get there. What you don't ever want to do, I think, is and he tries to throw the prerequisite.
Yeah, I was about to say,
there,
like
right?
he does sort of say, like, "Oh yeah, I know, duh, yeah."
Yeah. And so on the one hand, it's the first time I've heard someone at least publicly say no duh in a long time. On a public platform that doesn't happen very often.
Joel Webbon has brought no duh up to the scholarly heights of now we can all use it. Yes.
Duh. Yeah. Right. So now I feel like I can use that again. No duh. But yeah, I think it's kind of like the Canon Plus commercial thing that came out a while back for New St. Andrews College, and it had the picture of Johnny Cash flipping the bird, right? And in this supposedly classical Christian, this college. And so classical Christian liberal arts college is probably what they would say about themselves. But and it's kind of the same thing. Like I get what they were trying to do. I certainly wouldn't have done it that way. I don't think it was helpful in some respect to do it that way. And you could argue, I don't think it was appropriate to do it that way. But I get what they were trying to do. I just wouldn't have done it that way. And I think that this is the same thing. I get what he's trying to do, and he's not completely wrong in the sense that there is a difference. That there isn't in the respect that like it's all sin. Like you're not going to get like less punishment because you were a virtual pimp than but as long as it's women, right? like you're not going to get less hell because of that. However, it is less disordered that like we're talking about men and women than men and men or women and women. It's less disordered. And so, I mean, you could certainly say that as Romans 1 kind of points out, like this is a progression southward, right? And so like you could point to that and have that conversation for sure, but I don't necessarily this just wasn't a helpful way to put it. I don't know.
Yeah, well, yeah. If nothing else, I think this is a great example of the same thing as the commercial that you mentioned, is that sometimes, and hey, this goes for me too, right? Sometimes I think we don't necessarily, either one of two things. We don't think through how we're presenting an idea that is true. We're just not thinking through how we're presenting it, and therefore somebody misses the idea altogether. Or we're presenting it in a way that I think this is probably more in the direction of what he's doing. He seems to acknowledge the fact that he knows this isn't a great way to say it, but he's going to say it anyway. And in that case, I think it behooves us to, that's my juicy word, behoove, nice. Is that he knows that it's probably not going to be taken right and just doesn't care, which, I mean, whatever, to be fair, you can do whatever you want, right? It's a public platform. But I think in the, in the spirit of trying to teach people things and to make a point, as somebody that teaches things, you have to know how to communicate to your audience well to present your point. And so as a pastor, like, this, when you present a sermon, there are certain ways you could say something that may still get the point across, but will be lost in translation. And you could probably say it a different way. And so I think that's the same, like the classic Mark Driscoll clip where he's like, "Who do you think you are?" Right? Some people got lost. Yeah, people got lost all up in the sauce of like how he said it. When, I mean, the point was fair, but they got lost in the sauce because of how he presented it. And so it's one of those things that I think in this case, there is a crucial teaching here that gets lost, which is that Christians do and have held that there are different, when we're talking specifically about sexual sin here, that there are different levels of sexual sin because there are different implications and outcomes from those sexual sins. It doesn't make those sins any less sinny. It just means that there are, you like how I did that?
Yeah.
It just means that that there are implications. There is a difference, for example, of a man flirting, a married man flirting with a woman versus him committing adultery on his wife with that woman. Neither one of them are good, right? Duh. Yeah. See, now we can say duh. Neither one of them are. Neither one of those are good or right, but there is a different level of what has happened, though, as far as the breaking of the marriage covenant. And so when you're having like this discussion, I think honestly there probably should be sermons taught, and I'm sure some pastors have taught about this whole the different levels of what's happening here and the dangers of not recognizing, keeping, like you said, going down this path. But how we present it. If I got up and said sinning in the right direction this Sunday when I preach a sermon, no one's going to hear anything I say after that. They're just not. They're going to be so confused by that term that they're going to miss the point. And I don't know a whole lot about Joel. So this episode is really not about Joel as much as it is about how he said something. And you could argue that Joel could say things, or anybody could say however the things they want to say, however they want to say them, which is true. Cannon Press could put a commercial out with Johnny Cash with his middle finger up. Joel Webbon can say "sitting in the right direction." At the end of the day,
I say that men ought to be men.
Yeah. So I think at the end of the day, it becomes on the episode we were talking about evangelizing, and you said it really matters about like your intent. Are you trying to be vindictive, or trying to prove a point, or are you trying to actually evangelize? I think that same methodology has to come into play when we're just saying things. We live in a culture that's like, just say it, man. And if everybody gets offended, you're probably over the target. And you're like, okay, maybe that is true. Maybe you are over the target. But there's a way to be more precise in your target hitting. Instead of blowing up the whole block, I'm only going for this building. So let's be very specific about what I'm saying. Which I would argue Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 when he's specifically naming sins in order to make the point. And so that's my long, drawn-out, breathy response about the fact that how we say things matter as much as what we're saying. And it'll get lost if we don't say it necessarily, not the right way, but just in a way that they can understand it. So.
Yeah, and I think that it's the same when we think about, when you go back to know your audience, right? I mean, at the end of the day, like there are things that I could say, you mentioned it. There are things, actually, there was a moment when someone was preaching and was talking about how they thought God wanted them to do something, and then they did it, and it turned out not to work out. And the phrase that was used was, I felt like I got kicked in the balls. And everything after that, who knows what was said. And so I had conversation at one point, and just kind of made the point, like you could have said the same thing 100 different ways, punched in the gut. Like there are a lot of ways you could have said the same thing without putting a wall up for a whole bunch of folks who would have been in your audience, right? And so that's just an example that like you really do have, like, so let me just say it this way. I don't know Webbon. I don't know. I haven't even conversed with him. I haven't had interaction with him on X. I have no idea. But this, watching some of the rhetoric and things that have been coming out from him and some of his sort of compadres, and then like comments like this one, some of it makes me kind of feel that it's like maybe it's about reaction and not about actually having conversation. You know what I mean? Actually getting truth across. It comes off, at least, and I'm sure they're not doing this intentionally, but it comes off as if what you're trying to do is get a reaction, and therefore, for whatever reason, a lot of times that people do those kinds of things to get views, to drum up, views and subscriptions and whatever else, but
monetization.
And again, I'm not trying to, yeah, right. And again, I'm not trying to read into that. I don't know that that's what's going on, but that's at least what seems to be going on lately. Is that it's really more about reaction than having conversation and trying to convince, if that makes sense. So I don't know. I think, you really do have to know your audience, and a person has to have good motive and moral behind it. And we all fail at that for sure at times. So
yeah. I think your example of the whole kicked in the balls thing is a great example to the whole point here. Because like, I remember one time, because that's probably something that dude would say in a normal conversation. Like that's not probably, the reason. Yeah. And so I remember there was one time I was up and I was saying something and I was like, so we don't give a crap. And afterwards, somebody pulled me aside. I was like, I don't think it's a big deal. You don't think it's a big deal. Some people over there would, and they didn't hear anything after. And that was a really helpful thing early on in preaching, was because I was like, I was just talking how I would normally talk. Wasn't a huge thing for me. I wasn't even give a crap. Yeah, I give a crap. So,
meanwhile, everyone in the audience felt like they got kicked in the balls, man.
It was one of those things that from the pulpit, and I think this goes back to probably a couple episodes ago, like you mentioned about knowing your audience. It's one of those things where you have to, there are times to grab attention with your words. There are times where that is appropriate, in which you say something for the deliberate purpose of shocking someone out of boredom in order to listen. I think the difference between a good communicator and a shock jock is knowing the right time to do that. You can get a lot of clicks and a lot of monetization. The fact that Twitter is monetized or X is monetized, the reality that YouTube is monetized, the reality that Instagram is monetized, the reality that everything you put online can essentially be monetized if you get enough clicks, retweets, and comments, brings into the mix the knowledge of your audience can be used for evil or for good. Same thing with growing a church. Let's be honest. There are pastors that grew after 2020, not because they were preaching the gospel more boldly. It was because they were saying what the people wanted to hear, and so their church grew. And so it's one of those things where I think, you said motive is incredibly important. And I'm not, to be very clear, if you've made it this far, I'm not questioning Joel's motive. I also do not know Joel. I do think, though, in the world in which monetization is a reality, there are literal platforms. Let me just tell you this, and the only reason I know this is because of the level of social media following I have. This is the only reason I know this, because when numbers come into play, people reach out to you and they give you opportunities. And one of those opportunities is, hey, there's platforms in which if we give you a message, you can promote it out more and we'll pay you for those clicks. And you're like, this exists? And it 100% exists. And so it's one of those things where, and there is no obligation, by the way, for you to tell the people that your audience that are listening to you that you're doing this for money. There's no obligation for you to tell them that. And so it's one of those things where you have to, I think people have to be discerning in the voices you're listening to, because people can know their audience and use it for not great purposes. And so when we're thinking as communicators, as pastors, as people that are living in a world that is really driven by clicks and media and outrage, are we being discerning? Are we being transparent? Are we trying to communicate for edification and not for exasperation? I mean, Paul's whole point when he's talking to the Corinthians in Corinthians chapter 12, 13, and 14 is, great, you guys have tongues. You're not using them right. And so, great, you guys have the World Wide Web. You're not using it right. There's a gift that you've been given. Use it as you're supposed to use it for edification and so the unbelievers can hear the gospel, not so that everybody can think you're super slick, super smart, you're based. Who cares? If you're not using it for edification, it doesn't matter. You are, as Paul says in chapter 13, a noisy gong. You have a lot of things to say, but none of them are worth anything because everyone's missing the whole point. And so I think that's the really important thing when we're talking about how we're saying and what we're saying. Are we using the gifts we've been given? Not spiritual gifts. Obviously, the internet is different than spiritual gifts. But the gifts we've been given for the edification of others or not. And that's my last word. What do you got?
I agree. I mean, I think the bottom line of this story is I don't know what the motives are. But I do think that's something that all of us have to regularly check. Am I doing this to gain a following? And in some respect, that might not even be an incorrect motive if what we're attempting to do is good and godly, or if I'm trying to promote a product, well, of course, engagement and following, like, that's a big deal, right? So it's not like always bad to think that way. But as a Christian leader trying to speak Christian things, as a Christian leader, as a pastor or whatever, or as a seminary professor or whatever the situation might be, you have to regularly, I think, just because of human nature, we have to regularly check our motives. And again, not speaking to this particular, it just makes me think that, it makes me think about that, even in my own life. Like sometimes I'll say things that are point blank and blunt and sort of outrageous, or I'll be sarcastic or whatever. And I know that there have been times in my life and times on the internet that has been because I want people to like the video more than it's been because it's just needed to be said because it's true or because it will help someone, And certainly there are times when that's not the case, and it is the right reason, the right motive, but I think it's something that we always need to be looking at. And this also translates, this isn't only for content creators, right? This translates into life, like everyday life. When you're interacting with people, are you interacting with them wanting their praise and them to glorify you? Or like in Matthew 6, when he's giving the examples of the Pharisees giving money so that people will see, the Pharisees praying with big words so that people will hear them, like those kinds of, like, are you after the praise of people, or are you after what is right and good and true and to bring glory to God first? And I think that's something we always have to be asking ourselves.
Yep. All right, guys. Well, hopefully you found that helpful. If you did, leave a like. if I'll throw this in. Apparently, Joel Webbon has some like aeons that he occasionally distributes to the internet to defend him. That's what I heard along the line, at least. I don't know if that's true. But if you are an aeon here, please don't dislike this video a lot. That won't help the algorithm at all. So, or it will. It will. You should like. So. I don't know how this works. Anyway, so guys, if you found this helpful, like it. If you didn't, let me know why in the comments section. And if you're not subscribed, I don't know how many times I got to say this. I don't know what your problem is, guys. I don't know what your problem is. But if we haven't won you over with our intellect, with our strikingly good looks, let us present one last plea in the form of our outro song. I'll see you later.
Bye.
Babbling Pastors are on the mic. Rob and Michael ready to strike. Talking like faith and all the rest. Better tune in to hear the best. Number one.